Thanks for joining me for the next book in the four canonical Gospels, the book of Mark. And we won't go over everything that we went over in Matthew, but some things I will go over again just to make a point, or if Mark offers additional details. And these are they going to be the things that we'll go over here in chapter 1 of the book of Mark. John the Baptist, and I'll mention the Essenes as well. We'll talk about that. Continue to talk about it as we move forward. We talked about it when I went over when I went over Matthew. And then repentance for the remission of sin. Of course, repentance means to turn away from, and remission, it would be for the forgiveness of sin. And this is what Jesus and John taught in the Gospels. So in chapter 1 begins with God sending John to prepare the way of the Lord and make his path straight. And if you look at verse 4, look at verse 4, and verse 4 says, John did baptize in the wilderness, and he preached baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. He preached the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. So that was what John's message was. It was repentance for the remission of sins. And the way that Matthew words it is, this was part of the baptism. He didn't tell anyone to repeat after him, and then they were all set for the rest of their lives, because now they were saved. That was different. That's different than repentance for the remission of sins. John was a lay member of the Essene community. I went over that when we went over the book of Matthew, and I've gone over that before. So he couldn't bring non-members into the Essene grounds. But Qumran was a remote wilderness part of Israel where the Essenes and John could practice their Gnostic doctrine that the Jewish religious authorities opposed. And if you look at verse 6 says John was clothed with camel's hair. Well, the Essenes wore coats made of camel's hair during cold weather. So John baptizes Jesus, and verse 10, look at verse 10. And verse 10 says, the heavens opened, and the Spirit, like a dove, descended upon him. So this was the first coming, and we'll talk about the second coming later in Mark after the crucifixion. In verse 13, look at verse 13. And in verse 13, Satan tempts Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days, which is a month, a week, and 3 days. Pretty long fight. And then in verses 14 and 15, John is put in prison, and Jesus carries on John's message of repentance for remission or forgiveness of sins. And Jesus goes throughout Galilee preaching in synagogues and healing people, both inside the synagogues as well as in the streets. And the two sets of brothers begin to follow Jesus, the brothers of Simon and Andrew, as well as the brothers of James and John. John, of course, is the beloved disciple. So we're going to move into Mark chapter 2. And the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So in chapter 2, the Jewish religious authorities begin to harass Jesus about many things, including the Sabbath. And in verses 27 and 28, look at verses 27 and 28. And in verses 27 and 28, Jesus tells them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So we're going to move into chapter 3, where Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and then the religious and state authorities agree to kill Jesus just because he healed somebody on the Sabbath. And chapter 3 begins with the Pharisees placing a man who had a deformed hand in the synagogue to use as bait to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath. So it was the Sabbath, and they placed this man with a withered hand in the synagogue. They know Jesus is on his way. And so the religious authorities, they didn't like Jesus, and they wanted to accuse him of breaking some sort of religious or state law so they could kill him. And verse 5, look at verse 5. And verse 5 says, and when he looked at them with anger, being grieved because of the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And then in verse 6, the Pharisees, or the Jewish religious authorities, met with the state authorities known as the Herodians, and they agreed to kill Jesus because he healed this man on the Sabbath. But Jesus withdraws, and a massive crowd goes out to Jesus. And verse 8, says, they came from Jerusalem and from Edom, which is south of Judea, and from beyond the Jordan River. So from across the Jordan River and everywhere around Tyre and Sidon, thousands and thousands of people. And verses 14 through 19, Jesus ordains the 12 apostles. So what I'm going to do is, and he gives them power to heal and cast out demons, and he tasks them with preaching. And then verse 16, he begins to name them. So what I'm going to do is I'll list them here now. So here's the 12 listed here. I put them on the whiteboard from chapter 3 of the book of Mark. And so verse 16 says, Jesus surnamed Simon Peter. So his name was Simon, and then Jesus gave him the name Peter as an initiated name. And you'll notice as we go through the other Gospels as well, we're going to compare the lists of apostles in each Gospel, and they differ slightly. And that's because most of them had two different names. Their original name, and then Jesus gave them a new initiated name. Simon, he names Peter. And then James and John, he renames them Boanerges. And so Boanerges means sons of thunder, and then 4 you have Andrew, 5 you have Philip, 6 Bartholomew, 7 Matthew, 8 Thomas, 9 James. So there's another James. This is the second James. This is James, the son of Alphaeus. John and James, Boanerges, the sons of thunder, they are the sons of Zebedee. And so their father is Zebedee. And then so 10th you have Thaddeus. Now in Matthew, Thaddeus is listed as Lebbeus. And so we know now, after reading Mark, that Jesus named Thaddeus. He gave him the name Thaddeus. His original name was Lebbeus. So Lebbeus became a disciple of Jesus. He ended up becoming initiated in one of the top ones. That's why he's listed as one of the 12 disciples. He's listed as the 10th. And Jesus gave Lebbeus the new name of Thaddeus. And then later on, you're going to see where John, the beloved disciple, the son of Zebedee, and the brother of James, is going to be initiated, and he will take on a new name of Lazarus. So, and then number 11, you have Simon. Now, this is Simon the Canaanite, also known as Simon the Zealot. And then 12th, of course, you have Judas Iscariot, and he's the one who ends up betraying Jesus. So this list is basically the same as the list given by Matthew, but Mark gives a little more detail and explains that Jesus gave Simon the name Peter and gave the others a new name as well, like Lebbeus, who Jesus names Thaddeus. And so, and we're going to move right into 4. Where Jesus controls the weather and presents 2 sets of teachings. One public, one private. The public set were given in parables, and then privately he would explain the stuff to the disciples. So in verse 4, you look at verse 4 of chapter 4. In verse 4, Jesus has 2 sets of teachings, a public set of teachings done in parables. And in verse 34, look at verse 34. And verse 34 says, "He did not speak to the public without a parable." And when they were alone, Jesus explained everything to the disciples. And then chapter 4 ends with Jesus performing the miracle, of course, of calming the storm, or controlling the weather. I'm not going to put it on the board. We're just going to gloss over chapter 5. In chapter 5, Jesus heals the daughter of Jairus, who was a ruler in the synagogue. So we're going to skip chapter 6 and 7 and move into chapter 8, as 6 and 7 just repeat events we already went over in the book of Matthew. And in chapter 8, verses 27 and 28, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who people think he is?" And they say John the Baptist or Elijah from the Old Testament, which would mean reincarnation. The fact is, all the prophecies Jesus was fulfilling were prophecies made by Elijah in the Old Testament. And Jesus was continuing John's movement. Jesus inherited all of John's disciples, both before and after John was put in prison and then executed. Jesus and John were not regular Jews. They were part of a Gnostic sect known as the Essenes, who had their headquarters in a remote wilderness location known as Qumran in Israel. And verse 29, if you look at verse 29, it says Peter answers correctly by acknowledging Jesus as the Christ. And we're going to talk about forgiveness, and the religious authorities reject Jesus and John. So we're going to skip chapters 9 and 10 and move into 11. For anyone just joining last week, we finished going through every chapter of Matthew. So now I'm not going over all of the same stuff twice, but I do want to highlight certain things and go over all four of the Gospels. And in chapter 11, if you look at verses 25 and 26, Jesus says, "And when you pray, forgive anyone you have anything against, that your Father in heaven may forgive you. But if you do not forgive, your Father in heaven will not forgive you." And at the end of chapter 11, the religious authorities confront Jesus again in the temple of Jerusalem, which was rebuilt. It was the rebuilt temple after the first temple of Solomon was destroyed. So they rebuilt the temple of God, where the temple of Solomon stood. And the temple of Solomon, King Solomon's workers who built the temple were Freemasons. They were Freemason craftsmen who worked under the guidance of Hiram, according to the what's known as the Rosicrucian temple legend. And if anyone isn't familiar with it, you can check out the temple legend presented by Rudolf Steiner. So, looking back at the Old Testament and history, the Jews do nothing but dishonor and disobey and disrespect their own God, Yahweh. And Yahweh has to constantly punish the Jews in the Old Testament. One such example was when Yahweh punished the Jewish people by causing them to be exiled into Babylonian captivity and the Temple of Solomon to be destroyed. And now these very same Jewish religious authorities, who God constantly has to punish, are confronting Jesus in this rebuilt temple. in Jerusalem. And in verse 28, look at verse 28. In verse 28, they asked Jesus, who gave him the authority to act and teach and stuff like that in the temple? So Jesus tells them he will answer them if they answer a question for him first. And Jesus asks them if the baptism of John was from heaven or from men. And they were afraid, the religious authorities in the temple, who were trying to argue with Jesus and say that he had no authority. They were afraid to answer Jesus in front of everybody publicly in the temple, because the Jewish people accepted John the Baptist as a prophet, while the Jewish religious authorities rejected John and persecuted him. This was the reason why John preached in the wilderness, and what was a lay member of the Gnostic Jewish sect known as the Essenes, who were also persecuted by the established religious authorities, which is why they were in the wilderness also, and they had to keep their location secret in Qumran. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's anti-Semitic, what you're saying and stuff like that. But that's not the case. I can't follow Christ if I hate anybody. Plus, Jesus and his apostles were Jewish, and the Essenes and John the Baptist, all Jewish, but they were Gnostic Jews. These Gnostic Jews preserved the original Jewish spiritual teachings and lifestyle, while the Jewish religious authorities were corrupt and no longer serving or representing Yahweh. This is the true reason for Christ and for Jesus' mission to create a new bridge between God and man through Christ, because religion, including Judaism, had become tools of Satan and corrupted in subtle but key ways, really operating more as businesses and stuff like that. So we're going to move into chapter 12. Well, I'm going to talk about the poor widow, and so Jesus was watching people tithe or donate money in the temple in Jerusalem, while the religious authorities rejected Jesus and hated him and wanted to kill him. The Jewish people loved Jesus and believed him to be a prophet of Yahweh. And as Jesus is watching, he sees a poor widow come and donate 2 mites, which is a very, very small amount of money, maybe like 2 cents or something today. And Jesus called his disciples over and said, the poor widow donated more than everyone else by donating what equaled to more or less 2 pennies, because it was the last of her money and all that she had, while everyone else gave from their abundance, from the abundance of their wealth. Chapter 14, we're going to talk about the betrayal and the arrest. And so I'm going to skip chapter 13. In chapter 14, Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus. Judas is one of the 12 disciples known as the 12 apostles. Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Judas the apostle leads the chief priests to Jesus, and they arrest him. Luke and John should give additional details, and we're going to begin the book of Luke next week. So they arrest Jesus, and verses 55 through 57 explain how the chief priests wanted to sentence Jesus to death. They had several people lying or making false accusations against Jesus, but verses 56 Verse 56 says, their testimony contradicted each other. It didn't agree. So they just started beating Jesus and spitting on him like uncivilized savages. Chapter 15, we're going to talk about the unlawful crucifixion and karma for Pilate and Judas. So in chapter 15, verse 15, it says, forgot to put that up here, sorry about that. Verse 15, it says, so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas, then had Jesus beaten or scourged and sent to be crucified. So they beat Jesus and then tortured him to death by nailing him to a cross so that his body was suspended in the air to the cross by the nails. Now, in Wu Sabet, for example, and other traditions or cultures, they say, well, the Jesus story didn't really happen. It's just retelling old Egyptian stories related to Isis and Horus. And so it's true that the Jesus story does mimic the Egyptian story, but that doesn't mean that the Jesus story didn't happen. And so the Akashic records record everything that happens. And so we know that Jesus really was crucified and died. Now, not long after the crucifixion, both Pontius Pilate and Judas Iscariot committed suicide. Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus and got him arrested, and Pilate was the judge, of course, who sentenced Jesus to death, to be beaten and then tortured to death. Both of them killed themselves. And so we're going to move into the final chapter of the book of Mark, chapter 16. And he appeared in another form is the portion that I'm highlighting in verse 12. So Jesus is crucified in chapter 15 of Mark. And in chapter 16, Jesus Christ rises from the tomb and appears to Mary and some of the others. So this is the second coming. The first coming was when Christ entered Jesus during the baptism by John. Now they don't recognize Jesus, as you're going to see how, for example, in the other Gospels, Mary supposes that Jesus is the gardener, for example. This is because Jesus is in a new, incorruptible body. And chapter 16, verse 12, if you look at verse 12, it says, after that he appeared in another form to two of them as they walked and went into the country. We're going to continue next week with the book of Luke, followed by John. They're going to give additional details related to the second coming and the rapture, which already happened as the Gospels show. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.